I've been convinced of something, and it's hopeful for me. It's hopeful. I was in a conversation, and I've shared this story before when I was working at a Unitarian church. I got into a conversation with Aaron Hiller. Now, Aaron Hiller was an atheist. He quit believing in God because all 50 people in his B-17 gunnery class were killed. He was the only survivor. And after that, he said, I told God I'm not believing in him anymore. But he came to me one day, and he was just bitching up, and he said, the universe isn't different. It doesn't care about anything. And I said, well, Aaron, do you care? He goes, well, yeah, I care. And my view was, well, Aaron, maybe it just took the universe 13.7 billion years to care. And here we are at the front end of a metaphysic between being, life, and consciousness. It's what this show is about. It's how do we explore the very depths of what in God's name, what in whatever's name is going on here. And we've talked about being becoming life and life becoming consciousness through the three essential processes of complexification, differentiation, and semi-permeability. And those three essential processes that made being become life and life become aware of itself, well, they're still at play within consciousness itself. And so the continuing question is, what is consciousness doing through these essential processes? I'm convinced that one of the things we can see and say about what consciousness is at least reaching for is justice. And when I say justice, I don't want to get all hung up in definitions, but the definition I'm using is fundamental fairness. Okay, and we'll touch on some of that as we go along. And to me, and I've used this in previous podcasts, there are two root paradigms which reveal and are great indicators of this reaching for justice, and consciousness is purposefully doing this. And those are the two main religious metaphors or paradigms: reincarnation and the heaven and hell paradigm. Both of those say one thing to me that we can say for sure. Reincarnation is about everybody getting their due. If you're a bad person, you'll come back as a worm or something suffering. Heaven and hell, if you're bad, you go to hell. If you're good, you go to heaven. You see, justice is permeating the human family at its deepest level. Now, I want to say that, and try to stay within the metaphysics of this, that consciousness, this is something it's doing. But I want to also be clear that we do not have a justice system here. We have a legal system. Even those who are within the system no longer call it a criminal justice system. They call it a criminal legal system. And the whole system is biased towards money. So I want to just say that right out, that this is part of the resistance to what consciousness is trying to do. Yet I'm convinced that consciousness is trying to do this. It's looking for a way of reciprocity, of mutual benefit of all. It's like there are 4 laws of thermodynamics. The first one is the zeroth law, and it talks about thermal equilibrium. If you put gases together in a enclosed place, they'll all become the same temperature. They'll all disperse evenly. And that's what I am convinced consciousness is trying to do. It's trying to reach for something. And why is it doing this? Well, that's what metaphysics is about. It's the why of things. It's the why of processes. And it seems to me that I can say, greatly convinced, that consciousness is doing what being did to become life, and life did to become self-aware, and we are inside of it, and we are embedded in it. Justice, I am convinced, is one of the things that consciousness is doing via the three essential processes. And I will say, before I throw this in my cohorts' faces, I'm hopeful with this. It's very hopeful for me, because even as we struggle and suffer from injustice, to have a sense that consciousness, the greater piece of it, has evolved and sought to care for itself. Even many of the worst leaders they still have to, at some level, feed their people, give them, shelter and education. Well, you'd think North Korea's not doing that, but you hear what I'm saying, that the human family, this is part of one of the main thrusts, in my view, of what consciousness is doing. Now, I just laid out a whole bunch. My cohorts are Marianne Rudis from Spokane Valley and Bob Hayes from Florida. And my name is Red Hawk, and I'm up here in Spokane. Bob, I'll start with you. What do you say about this justice piece of the consciousness reaching for justice, if you will?
Okay, I'll start off by freely admitting that in my homework for this week, my mind was just spinning in many different directions. And I understand how you want to stay away from the legal side of things. But what I'll say is that the whole concept of justice is something created by consciousness and instituted through group effort. Now, that hasn't always worked, but I agree it's always been at the root of how consciousness is motivated. We've got this imbalance, or seeking for balance between the good of the individual and the good of the group. And that's always been at the heart of the concept of justice. Because one person feels like they've been put upon, and they go to their neighbor and say, well, what are you going to do about this? And if you multiply that by a global number, you see that everyone is striving toward what they individually think they're due against what the group thinks it can do. And we see this all through history. Look at the whole concept of the bodhisattva in Buddhism. An individual is not going to accept moving to nirvana until everyone is able to move to nirvana. And that's the idea. And I've talked in past shows about the numbers game. And how is it just for someone to have a yacht and someone else to be starving in Sudan? You've got those opposites that are this incredible tension that's going on. And enlightenment is moving toward the idea that everyone is due a fair and just system. And all of these artifacts that we've built over the ages, whether they be the Hammurabi texts or the Supreme Court or whatever, it's all a bunch of individuals getting together and trying to figure out how the group can be more fair toward more people. And that's kind of where I am at this point.
Well, and that was the reciprocity piece, benefit for all. And again, well, I'm going to let Marianne have her say, as every time one of y'all speaks, it's like 20 more questions hit my head. So go for it, Marianne.
Well, I think the whole concept of justice is something that we strive for, or some of us strive for, but we're so far away from it. What pops into my head is the term justice is blind, right? Because for justice to occur, it has to be impartial, it has to be objective, and when it gets put into the hands of fellow human beings, that's very, very hard to accomplish. And so what do we do? So we create these systems, right, to try and mitigate that. And the systems start out with good intentions and ultimately they fail. And so I think where we're at now is we have to find new systems. We have to find new ways for everyone to be able to be recognized as worthy of impartiality, of worthy of living their life free from oppression, free from poverty, free from lack, and how do we distribute resources that are just? And then you get into the whole merit-based idea that, well, some people don't deserve that, some people don't deserve this, and again, that's justice being put into the hands of our human mind. So how do we rise above that? That's kind of where I go with this. Well, how do we rise above our own biases to be able to understand that justice is something that it's a higher concept that needs to embrace all of us? I don't know.
And what you're really getting at is instituting it is very difficult and usually short-sighted. It becomes, has a point of diminishing returns because of the biases that are built into it. If you got money, you could ride the legal system and just put stuff off if you got the money to do that. And I don't want to bog down in that. My question to both of you is, why is justice important to the evolution of consciousness? Why is this piece, even through all its foibles and its limitations, but it's still it's a quality of consciousness that seems deeply embedded and very important. Why?
Well, do you want to go ahead?
In an oversimplified way, it's because consciousness cannot evolve unless it's in a substrate of safety and security. And if someone is not at that level, then the only thing they can do is fight for their own safety and security. And they may then do unjust acts to try and maintain their own safety. And if you can, look across the spectrum of wealth and so forth, why does a wealthy person strive to make more money? Because they think that it's going to make them more safe and secure. And we have to figure out a way to have a baseline of safety and security for everyone in order for consciousness to have that same universal substrate for it to evolve new and better ideas. You don't get a new and better idea from someone who's starving to death.
Yet,
go
ahead, Marianne.
And the idea that consciousness is one, right? And it flows through all of us. So it's are
one in
all.
Many. That's
right, but it diversifies. But if we can remember that what is in one is in all, and what is just for us is just for others, and the way we treat others is the way we're actually treating ourselves, and so it becomes this idea of unity, and that's how consciousness can grow or advance.
And I want to suggest that Bob. That the big jumps of consciousness and of learning and possibly evolution have come out of war and conflict. Even Da Vinci sold himself as a designer of defenses and weapons. So I think that this is part of the issue, that it's the very piece of struggling that creates, I think, of the Marshall Plan. Could anybody have thought that globally before the Second World War? And so I think conflict is part of it. I think part of justice is putting an end to suffering. I think that's what compassion is. So it's this balance piece of dark and light, of conflict and at ease, and the awareness of the great divide between the starving person somewhere on the planet, probably North Korea, and places like that, and those who are the rulers and the money people of the world that have more money than they'll ever have. I think there's a point where it's ego, and now we're back to the impediments of justice, which are ego, the instituting of it itself impedes it, the whole piece. And I think both of you nailed it. Marianne, when you talk about oneness, and Bob, when you talk about the need for us to work together and have security, a world where everybody has food to eat, a place to sleep, education, and security. Not only will we all feel safer, but we can really take off in new ways that I don't think the human family has ever experienced. And I think that's part of why justice, the why of justice in the whole thing, is because there are places that we can go with our consciousness that we cannot even begin to imagine because of our inability of this reciprocity of benefit to all and to somehow manage that as a planet. But remember, we're the first generation to see the planet as a planet. We're the first generation to see the world as an interdependent happening. So we're only couple generations in at this point.
Yeah, I agree. In terms of this being the first time we've had a global perspective, but if we look across history, we see little pockets like Athens in 500 BC, where for some reason the citizens of Athens, not the slaves, but the citizens of Athens, were given enough free time that they could develop probably most of the ideas that still Western civilization is grappling with. And that's what I'm talking about in terms of having safety and security, because that little pocket, and there's been a few others, the Yellow River in China at certain points in history, different places where there's been a spark of justice, even though from our modern perspective, we don't see Athens as being all like justice a society. It was just for a few of them, and enough so that they could come up with these ideas. But it serves as a small laboratory to show us what we need to do globally, that we need to figure out how to give people that idea of safety and security, not just the idea of it, but the truth of it, the feeling of it, so that they can get beyond it. And we see all of the fear mongers and the hate mongers and all of these people who are using that because it makes them feel more secure. And we have to figure out a way, as Marianne says, to look at ourselves as one, to look at ourselves all as neighbors and brothers and sisters, rather than as someone competing with us or trying to hurt us.
And another example of that small pocket would be apartheid and the way that whole process, a lot of people could still be in jail from that, and it would have been just. And yet, justice took a new turn. And I think that that's part of the forgiveness, the love, the hope, and all of those things that are involved in this, the soft edge.
And look at the way Desmond Tutu handled it at the end of apartheid. He led the way toward a, as you say, forgiveness, but reconciliation and having people take responsibilities for past actions. And dare I say, probably South Africa is a little bit ahead of the rest of the world in terms of how the different races are getting along and contributing to each other's well-being. It's not perfect now, but it's sure gone a long way. And I credit Desmond Tutu and that whole group that he founded along with Nelson Mandela, who changed the way they looked at what had happened during apartheid.
And what they did is they applied the golden rule. Go ahead, Marianne.
Well, I was going to say, and I think what that is, it exemplifies that we have to see the inherent value in every human life, even those who oppress you. And so that is a beautiful illustration of that in action. And it's not an easy thing to do. But to be able to go to that place of even misguided individuals have an inherent value in their life. And so how do we recognize that in each other and then come together to create a more just society?
Amen. And I always thought, narcissistic people make really good used car salespeople. And I think that's why they're here. I'm being facetious, of course.
Because everybody needs a car, right?
Yeah. Well, I want us to see the play of the golden rule. I talked about the two ruling paradigms of heaven, hell, and reincarnation. But whether it's either of those or comes out of China, which is more ancestor worship kind of stuff, the golden rule is at play in every people. And that's this empathy piece. That's why I think justice came to light in self-awareness. Because as we became self-aware, we started to see that the other person had feelings too, that the other person was suffering also. And to help alleviate my suffering, a part of that would be relieving them of their suffering. So this interdependence, Margaret Mead says the first humans we can go back to are the ones where we find their bones and one had been broken and it had healed. And what that says is someone was immobile and was being taken care of for the time it took for that bone to heal. And that, in Margaret Mead's view, an anthropologist, was the beginning of care, the beginning of compassion, the beginning of who we are as human beings, that we do care.
Yeah, and the idea of empathy is so intertwined with self-awareness, because there is no self-awareness until we become aware of others. It's our awareness of others that enables us to perceive ourselves as a separate entity. We see ourselves as mirrored in others. And without that empathy, without that ability to some extent, walk in the other's shoes, there is no self-awareness.
Well, isn't that, when you said that, all of a sudden a 3-year-old popped into my head, right? Because in the development, so maybe in our evolutionary consciousness, we're 3-year-olds, right? And hopefully we're going to get a little bit, maybe we're 7-year-olds, but to be able to adapt and be empathetic and aware, it's... Yeah.
Or maybe where we are, and this is a good way of talking about Marianne, is we're at childhood's end. And it's time for us to become responsible. We can no longer afford to think like a 3-year-old or a 7-year-old, that the repercussions and consequences are too great with the tools we have in our hands. So, and I'm working on a song called Childhood's End, so it fit right in.
I agree. It's time to grow up.
Yeah.
Well, let me throw a little wrench in. At best, I think we're adolescents. And think about how crazy we were when we were adolescents.
That's right. And growing up is hard to do.
Way to go.
That's a hard jump.
And anyone who lived through adolescence is here by probably pure chance, right? Because we did lots of stupid things in those years. And as a human species right now, we're doing lots of stupid things in the world. And it's time that we grow up. You're right.
The first time my dad tossed me the car keys, I went out and played a game of chicken. And it was stupid. And thank God both of us turned away because we were both chicken. And I often use that as a metaphor of where the human family has been since the Second World War. We're still in a game of chicken, and it's just there's more people coming into the game. And this is the piece we have to outgrow. And I think that's a huge piece of awareness of justice and what constitutes fundamental fairness. I don't think that can ever be embedded in the law. My understanding of Jesus, in some historical sense, was that he was saying the law can't hold it, man. What it is bigger than that. We're all connected. And he called it love. He called it neighbor. He called it the suffering. He called it the grieving. He called it at these junctions where empathy was at play and called a response that was fair and just, and saying, if you were this poor and this destitute, what would you want? What would you need? And to be able to walk a mile in that person's moccasins, if you will. The whole concept, and Bob, you brought this up in the great divide of the human family. I thought of a video of a woman who would follow ants around to find out where they were going and then dig into their ant hole and see if she could find any grains of rice that they had gotten that she had missed. And she walked away with, maybe 50 grains of rice, and she didn't eat any of it. It was all for her children. It's this peace that lets us in, that moves us, that moves beyond sentiment, if you will. And I think that is the growing edge of justice in my mind. So, having said all that, justice, what are your final comments, Mary Ann?
I think we were talking earlier about for consciousness to grow, for justice to be able to be in the world. I thought of the idea that our basic needs need to be met on a human level. And the idea of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So how do we get that to that place where we recognize the inherent value of every human life, and that everyone, if we can get everyone to a place of safety when it comes to their basic needs being met, and then we grow from there. So that's we want to create a just world, and I think you're right. It can't be institutionalized, and it comes back to that our personal responsibility. Each one of us acting in a just manner, and then that's going to permeate. But there are a lot of people that don't. So,
well, I'm going to respectfully disagree with you, Mary Ann.
okay.
I don't think it can happen without institutions, because a bunch of individuals running around trying to be just to each person they meet is not going to cut it. We have to find a way to develop or modify existing institutions to be just in and of themselves. They are tools of consciousness. Our institutions are what allow us to interact with more people. And if we can make those institutions just, then we can spread justice throughout a wider range.
Okay, I shouldn't jump in, but I have to, because our institutions are made up of people. And so I think people
Absolutely.
have to be just. And then the institutions.
All right. Now I'm gonna have to cut you guys off, and I'm going to go to Revelations, which the whole piece of Revelation, a huge piece of it is our institutions will always fall short. Therefore, they have to have a self-reflecting aspect. That's what the Lamb of God was. You create everything to help those who are in the pits of injustice, but knowing that once you deal with them, it won't be unjust for them anymore, but it'll be somewhere else. It'll pop up, and the system needs to shift itself in order to respond to the new injustice, the new suffering. So that's my postscript for today. So, consciousness is a trippy thing. It really is. And you know, Bob, you used the word mirror. I think our institutions try to mirror us and our shortcomings. And something that does that, you know, when I was in college, I took a history of Western civilization, and the teacher taught the whole thing through art, of how art evolved and how it reflected humankind and where we were. And then later on, I started going into Asia and looking at their art, and my gosh, it reflected the very people that it was coming from. And it can give us a huge insight into these places of consciousness evolving and how we do that. Whether it's Asia and the art of Buddhas everywhere, and a teaching all through China, all through India, oh my gosh. Or whether it's the pictures like the Pieta of a suffering child in a mother's lap. Oh, art, it says so much about us, about consciousness, about where we're going and where we've been, and maybe what we're reaching for. Until then, may the oneness of the great just, whatever the hell it is, be with you, and mostly, may it flow through you as a blessing. Peace.